right. So, hi everyone. I'm Jake from Baselane. Very excited to be here today with our special guest. Kirby, do you mind giving a quick introduction to yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Kirby Atwell. I'm the host of the Living Off Rentals podcast, and I've been pretty much a full-time real estate investor since 2011 when I got out of the Army, and got into short-term rentals around 2017 and have learned a lot about what drives cash flow and what works better than others in terms of short-term rental properties. And I think what I'm going to share with you today is sort of a counterintuitive strategy that most people don't think about when they think of short-term rentals, but it's a super high cash flowing strategy. So I'm excited to share this with you today.
Fantastic. And I think we're all excited to learn. I've said myself, I'm excited to learn. My wife and I have been debating buying an STR, short-term rental property, and think I'm going to pull the trigger after this show.
Good.
Just to give you some insights on the audience before we get started. So for our first question, we asked, how many rental properties do you currently own? 24% of the audience currently have no rental properties. So looking for some first-time investors, 29% have one, 14% have two or three properties. And then there's a few in here, but another 14% who have 11 plus. So some really big investors and some newbies as well, which is fantastic, a nice mix. To the question, have you bought a property specifically for short-term rental before? Only 13% have said yes. So 87% of the audience, this is new to them about buying a short-term rental. For most people, oh, sorry.
No, I just said perfect. That's great.
Fantastic. For most people, the majority of the audience, about 78%, are mostly in mid and long-term rentals right now. So yeah, lots to learn. I'm sure a lot of people are wondering about making the jump and excited to learn about your journey in going from long-term to short-term. And how much do you know about STR investment? 41% said they have no experience. 55% know the basics but want to learn more. And then 9%, they know a lot, but they want to find new ideas. So really excited. So Kirby, can you just give us a brief overview of how you started in short-term rentals? I know your journey was kind of more traditional, and then you took the leap. So we'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, so I'll share a little bit in the presentation that I've got lined up too about my background. But I started with flipping properties, and then I kind of transitioned into long-term rentals, and then I kind of got into short-term rentals by accident. You know, we had lived in Chicago, and that's where I grew up and I was investing. And then we moved over to Northwest Indiana, where we moved into this house that had a unfinished basement. It was a walkout basement, and it had all this extra space. And I kept hearing about short-term rentals. This was right around 2017. And I was like, let's just try it. You know, if we spend $30,000 on the basement and turn it into a one-bedroom apartment, what's the worst that can happen? You know, it probably adds value to the property. If it doesn't work, we can always rent it as a long-term rental. And we tried it, and we made just over $20,000 from the time we finished just before Memorial Day to Labor Day. And it was like just the summer. And so I was thinking about it, and I was like, I don't make that much income on some of my long-term rentals that are full houses that I rent for the full year. And so, but I just made it on this little one-bedroom basement apartment. And so I realized there's something to this, and that's when I really got started with it.
That's fantastic. And so, like, just based on your story and based on the amount of profit you were able to make off that, I'm really excited to dive into the presentation. So if you don't mind, let's dive in and start learning. This is fantastic.
Awesome. Cool. Let me just share my screen here. So
Yep.
I've got some slides just to keep me on task here. Let me know if you can see that okay.
Yeah, we can. Got it there.
Awesome. Cool. So let's dive in. So like I said, I'm the host of the Living Off Rentals podcast. You can check that podcast out. I've interviewed about 240 really smart real estate investors. So it's a great resource for some really sharp individuals. But today, what I want to talk about is the strategy that really got us to financial freedom about 3 years ago. And that's the ideal type of short-term rental that really drives the absolute highest cash flow. And there's really two components to this, or two things that I really want to dive deep on today. Number one, I'm going to talk about how to find the absolute highest cash flowing market and deal that's out there when it comes to short-term rentals. And then number two, I want to share some actual examples of deals that I've done recently, or people I've worked with have done recently that, you know, are deals that we closed this year, not deals from 2021 that people use historical numbers that looked a little bit better post-pandemic. This is deals that are happening right now, and the cash flow is really off the charts. So, but first off, yeah, let me just share a little bit about me so you know who's talking to you today. Like I said, I graduated from West Point in 2005, and I served 6 years as an active duty officer in the Army. And while I was in the Army, picked up the book Rich Dad Poor Dad, which I like to call the gateway drug into real estate investing, because it seems like half my podcast guests got started by reading that book. But it really shifted my mindset, and that's what really got me into real estate investing back in 2006. And so I knew that's what I wanted to do. And in 2011, decided to leave the Army, and I started a flipping company with some friends from back home in Chicago. And so over the next 5 years, we flipped about 70 properties. And I kind of fell into this strategy of flipping just because it seemed like that's how you make a bunch of money with real estate, right? Like it's sexy. Like there's all the shows at the time on TV, like all these before and after pictures, and they show like price they bought it at and what they rehabbed it for, and then this huge profit number. And it seems like everyone makes so much money flipping. And we flipped about 70 properties. And 5 years later, I realized I'm in the exact same financial position that I was when I started this. I met some great people, learned a lot of lessons, but when it comes to actual profit, I was, I didn't have anything to show for it because we had no asset and we had no cash flow. So we were on this hamster wheel of just every time we'd find a property, rehab it. If there was anything left over, we'd usually put it right back into the business and just take out enough to live off of and start that whole process over again. So, in 2016, this is what I felt like. I felt like I was on this treadmill that I was going to die on because there was no way to get ahead. We kept thinking more volume of more deals and bigger deals that would get us ahead, but it never did. It was always this giant treadmill. So in 2016, I decided I was going to shift my entire business, kind of reinvent myself, and start over again, and start buying assets. And so started investing in, these are some of the long-term rentals that I started buying around the Chicagoland area. And built up a portfolio of 24 long-term rentals. And these were okay, it was great. I started experiencing the power of cash flow, which was awesome. But I realized that at $400 to $500 a month, which is typically a really good cash flow on an affordable long-term rental, I was going to need a lot of them to get to a place of actually living off my rentals, which was my goal at the time. And so, as the company grew, the infrastructure grew, so did the overhead. And so it was tough to get ahead again with building enough long-term rentals to actually live off of. So in 2000, a couple of years later, it's 2018. So we had moved over to Northwest Indiana from Chicago. We tried the one in our basement, like I talked about, and it worked. It worked great. And so I decided, let's just try this on a separate property. And so this was the first short-term rental that we bought in Michigan City, Indiana, which is the main town that we invest in. And my thought process was, if it started pouring here, if you hear a little bit of background music or a background noise here, it's right, it's like coming down like crazy. But so my thought process was, this property is super cheap. It needs a lot of rehab, but if I fix it up and furnish it, worst case scenarios, I can convert it to a long-term rental, and it does decent. And so I was looking at the comps on Airbnb, and I was running the numbers, and I was like, even if it rents half the year, it's still more cash flow than a long-term rental. So that's what we did. And we still own this property, and it started producing $1,250 a month of average net cash flow after all of our expenses. And so obviously much better than the long-term rentals that I was investing in a similar price point. And so we started buying some more properties. And then eventually we found this property, which is a duplex property. Again, very affordable. It didn't look like this when we bought it. It looked pretty nasty. There was, call them tenants or squatters or whatever you want to call them in each unit. Needed a lot of rehab. And so we bought the property, rehabbed it, and started renting it out. And again, it was experimental. I was like, is somebody really going to rent a duplex, like stay in a duplex as a short-term rental in a blue-collar industrial town in Indiana? Like, this isn't your traditional short-term rental. And this thing has cash flowed $3,500 a month ever since, because we're all into it for about $125,000. And it stays booked up because it's an affordable, nice place with two sets of income coming in. So that's when I realized the power of multifamily short-term rentals or multi-unit short-term rentals. And so then after we did that for a while with a few more multi-units, our personal goal was to buy a farm. We wanted to live on a farm. We wanted to have some acreage. We wanted to start to get a little wet here. We're down in Southwest Florida right now. So all of a sudden in the afternoon, it starts pouring. But we wanted to have some land, grow our own food, spend a lot of time with our family. These are some of our personal goals. And so we incorporated this strategy into our personal life as well, which was really awesome to be able to do this because we found this farm that was 45 acres, hadn't been lived in 15 years. So it was all overgrown. But we could get a conventional mortgage on it because it had this house, which needed to be fully rehabbed. But then it had all these outbuildings as well. So you can see in the background here, this red pole barn was there, this 1800s old barn. There's a big garage. So we rehabbed the house first, moved in, and then we put right here in this pole barn, we put an Airbnb unit. And we also put a gym in here, and I got a podcasting studio in here. But this 800 square foot short-term rental in this barn pays for the entire 45-acre farm. So it made us basically cost neutral when it came to our cost of living. And so it got us to a point about 3 years ago of getting to a place of financial freedom, and my wife and I being able to leave our full-time jobs and just live off the income from our short-term rentals. And that was really our goal from the start. It was kind of two things. It was number one, autonomy. We wanted to control our time. We didn't want to have to, be where somebody else told us we need to be at a certain time. And we wanted to have some flexibility. And then number two, we wanted to be able to create an impact on other people. And so that's what we strive to do today, and do stuff like this where we share this with other people. So that's a little bit of background about me. And so I want to dive into really what drives the best type of short-term rental, in my opinion, when it comes to getting to a place of financial freedom and high cash flow. So when most people think the term short-term rental or vacation rental, I feel like this is what most people envision. Like most of the time, it's like the high-end cabin in the mountains, or it's the beachfront property. And this is what you typically think of. Most of the time, you don't think of this type of property. This is one we own in Michigan City, and it's a 2-unit, nothing special. Just upstairs here is 1 unit, it's a 1-1, and then downstairs on the first floor and basement is a 4-2. So you've got 2 separate sources of income coming in, but it's in a blue-collar town, industrial town, just a regular neighborhood. And we bought it for less than $200,000. You would think that the one in the mountains would be far superior to the one that I just showed you. But when you actually break it down and you look at the details of ROI and cash flow, it tells a very different story. So I pulled a listing from Gatlinburg, which is a very popular short-term rental destination that most people kind of default think to when they think about, what's a great place to buy a short-term rental. And this is a brand new built, high-end, big cabin, all the amenities. It's got an indoor pool here. It's got a feeder room. I mean, all the trappings, definitely costs more than $1 million to build this property. And you would think that that property would have all 5 stars because it's got all the amenities. It's done, how could it not be a 5-star property, especially compared to this 1-1? This is the top floor of this property that I just showed you. This is the listing on the top floor there. And so you would think this is by far a superior property. So it's going to have much better reviews. And it's going to have a much, much higher price point. But that's just not the case. That's just not how it works. Because different people, I think there was 400 million stays or experiences on Airbnb just last year, not including VRBO, direct bookings. So you figure the vastness of guests, you really have to think through who you're appealing to and what type of product you want to deliver to that type of guest. So it's much easier to exceed expectations on the type of property that we're providing, and it's at an affordable price point. But because we have 2 units, you can see the nightly rate on this one and on the cabin. Because we have, and these are just random dates, so I don't know if they're not even the same dates, but they're summertime, probably peak season dates. But because we have 2 units, now we have a 4-2 under this, which rents for about double what this one does at least. We're actually making about the same level of income. Our ratings are actually higher, and our price point is 1/5 of what this property, the single family cabin is in Gatlinburg. Now, I'm probably not sharing my property on Instagram nearly as much as this guy. You know, it's not as sexy to own a duplex. I admit that. But when it comes to the cash flow, the net cash flow left over, not what the income is, don't look at the gross income, but what the net cash flow is, I promise you, it's substantially, it's multiple times higher on this 2-unit property. So I wanted to share what some of the attributes are that I would highly recommend trying to stack if you're interested in the highest cash flow possible. And there's 8 attributes, and these are rules of thumb. So it's not like if you have a property or a location that doesn't adhere to one of these attributes, that it's not going to make sense, or it's not going to work for you, or it's not going to cash flow. But the more of these you can stack, the higher the cash flow typically. So number one, what I recommend is buying what's worked really well for me and for several hundred people that I've worked with over the years to help them implement this, is buying just outside of a larger city. So if you buy in the city, that's typically where there's the most most bureaucracy, the most restrictions when it comes to short-term rentals. The price point typically is about 3-4 times as high as buying just outside of the city. And if you buy just outside, you still capitalize on being close to a population center. So there's still going to be a lot of people traveling for weddings, funerals, work, all the things that people just travel for in general when there's population. But then you also are close by to where there's access to the city, and then people can get to your property from the city as well if they want to get out of the city. So there's a lot of advantages to buying just outside of a larger city. The second thing is I don't recommend just buying anywhere outside of a large city. So I don't just pick like a random spot that has no draws to it, but pick a place where there's some local draws, so it doesn't have to be, you don't need to buy a short-term rental right next to Disney World. Like, pick a place that has, like where we're at, Michigan City. Again, we're an hour outside of Chicago. We've got a huge outlet mall. We've got Lake Michigan beaches. We've got wineries. We've got a big casino. So these are, nobody from California is flying in a vacation in Michigan City, Indiana. I'm aware of that. But yet there's draws for people from Chicago, from Detroit, from Indianapolis to come and visit for the weekend. In addition to, just, again, the utilitarian reasons that people would go to Michigan City anyway. An investor-friendly state. Like, so again, I grew up in Chicago, used to invest in Chicago. I love Chicago, but man, I tell you, my first time trying to get a permit in Chicago, I remember back to it, it took 9 months to get a building permit for rehab in Chicago. And it was a painful lesson. Like, I'm sitting there holding hard money at 12% for 9 months before we start on a pretty significant rehab. And throughout the whole time I was there, it was just every inspector was different. The red tape and bureaucracy that existed in Chicago compared to when I moved to Indiana. I walked in to get my first permit on our property, and they're like, here's a 1-page form you need to fill out. So I filled it out, handed it to her, and she's like, here's your permit. And I was like, what? It's like, don't you want to take me in the back and rough me up a little bit like they do in Chicago? Like, don't I have to give you like a blood sample or something? So, it's just night and day different. So if you can pick a place that's business friendly, investor friendly, low taxes, low rules, low bureaucracy, like I know in the paper or in the news, you would think that every place is banning short-term rentals. Michigan City likes short-term. They want more short-term rentals because it's helping their economy. It's an old industrial town. So, all the tourism is helping their economy. So why pick a place where you're going to have a ton of obstacles right from the start? Again, it is super, super important. Like, multiple streams of income. And it doesn't have to be a traditional duplex or triplex. It can be a pool house that's finished in the backyard. It's a separate unit. It could be a finished basement, like I talked about, a barn, like I talked about. Just as long as there's multiple streams of income and you're buying a relatively low cost property, the income typically from short-term rentals is so high that you're going to have really significant cash flow if you're able to buy a multiple unit property. This is the equation that if you want cash flow, this is really what you should be obsessed with. So you can do the research and find out what the nightly rate and occupancy is for any town. You can use airdna.co, and they'll tell you what the average occupancy and nightly rate is for a town, and then compare that to the average purchase price, because these things don't move in tandem. It's not like if I buy in $1 million average purchase price, it's going to have equal nightly rate and occupancy to if I buy in $100,000 average purchase price, the nightly rate and occupancy. So look for the differential to be high in your favor, where the income is much more in your favor than the a high nightly rate and occupancy compared to a low. This one is just, from the ability to sleep well at night. I think this is so important that nobody knows what the future is going to hold. Nobody knows if there's going to be a COVID 19.7 or whatever we're on now, where they're going to lock down again, and no one's going to be able to travel, or a new administration is going to change the rules on short-term rentals or whatever. There's risk in anything, but I know that if rules change or something happens, I could convert all my properties to long-term rentals, and they won't cash flow nearly as well as short-term rentals, but I won't have negative cash flow across 24 different properties. They all will still have positive cash flow, and I'll be just fine. This is a really important one too, that every person out there has some sort of competitive advantage, whether it's a personal connection that you have, a skill set that you have, just a certain amount of knowledge that you have about an area. So I see all the time people just say, well, this guy is investing in this area, so that's where I need to buy a short-term rental. But you're unique, and the great thing is this can work in so many different areas, and sometimes it's right in your backyard where it can work well. So think about what your personal competitive advantage is, or what your connections are. Maybe it's somewhere you grew up, where you have some contacts, and I would start there. And so if you do these first 7 and stack as many of these on top of each other as you can, and you buy in an area that meets as many of these criteria as possible, you're going to have some really great cash flow. And so that's the first, I think the first goal that you should shoot for. But then on top of that, if you really want to choose like the unicorn type deal, or the mecca of investments, then pick a property that meets as many of those first 7, but also is in the path of progress. So what I mean is that don't get blindsided by short-term thinking where, okay, I'm going to buy just based on cash flow. Maybe I'm paying too much, or I'm buying in an area that I think is not going in the right direction. Think about 20 years from now, am I going to be super excited to own in this area? And if that's the case, and you've hit as many of these first 7 as possible, now you're sitting on a property that's cash flowing several $1,000s a month of net cash flow. And 20 years from now, you're going to wake up and it's worth 2-3 times as much as it is today, while you collected several $1,000s a month in the meantime. So, that what I mean by the path of progress is just like an area where the policymakers are making good decisions. People are moving in instead of moving out. Like the crime's decreasing. They're building more attractions. They're investing in infrastructure. It might not be a perfect place today, but you can see it's improving, and that's going to lead to appreciation above average over the next 20 years. So I want to share an example of somebody I work with who just recently followed this process and followed those 8 factors as much as possible. And his name's Alvaro, and he lives in California, and I believe he's a Baselane user as well. So he decided to buy in Battle Creek, Michigan. He bought this 2-unit, and these are listing pictures of when he bought it. So very turnkey type of property, which I recommend, especially if you're buying cross country, so you didn't have to do a big rehab. And this is what the listing looked like when he just listed it, just recently, just like, I think it was about a month and a half ago when he listed it. So didn't have to do a whole lot from the time he bought it to the time he listed it, but he furnished it, made it look really nice, great listings. So here's what the numbers look like on his deal. And you can look up the address and see what that these are factual numbers here, but he bought it for $165. He put about $40,000 into it. That's what it looks like now. And his initial estimates based on the comps, the other Airbnbs in the area, is about 292 average daily rate between the two units. So that's less than $150 a night. Very affordable for a short-term rental. And it'd be lower in the winter time, higher in the summertime when it's its peak season. But he also calculated the property sitting vacant almost half the year. So based on his and I always recommend run your numbers as conservative as possible. Look at the comparables, look how they're performing, and then run it in the worst case scenario. So this is like his worst case scenario. So it sits vacant for 41% of the year. And this is what his income looks like. So if you multiply, 292 by 59 by 365, you can see on a monthly basis, he's making 6530 of net income or of gross income. And then he's got his cleaning fees, he's got his utilities, his yard maintenance. I always recommend a set aside for maintenance, things that pop up, taxes, insurance. So his monthly expenses, again, on a conservative estimate, are about 3,500. So his net cash flow on this $165,000 property is over $3,000 a month. And the great thing is that Alvaro is still working a full-time job in California. He just visited Michigan for the first time a couple of weeks ago and got to stay in his own property, but he did everything remotely from California. And so now he's working on his second property. So while he's working a full-time job in California, if he just replicated this process 4 times, he could easily replace his income and create enough net cash flow to live off of with just 4 properties. So it doesn't take 50 or 100 long-term rentals to get to a place of actually living off the income from your short-term rentals. I want to show you another example here. So this is a property that is a short-term rental in Destin, Florida, which again is one of the most popular locations over the last several years for buying a short-term rental. And if you look at the averages for Destin, you've got $660,000 basically is the average purchase price for a property in Destin. And then if you go to AirDNA, like I mentioned, you can see the average occupancy rate is 61%, and the average nightly rate is 374. So pretty strong. So it sounds like that would equate to some pretty strong cash flow and be an ideal type of place to buy. But I wanted to just go through the numbers on a typical, like if you just use the averages for Destin, Florida, what that would look like. So at an average nightly rate of 374 and an average occupancy of 61%, you'd make about $84,000 a year, which is about $7,000 a month of gross income. Then you look at the average purchase price, again, of $660. And if you got a typical investment loan, they're going to cover about 80% of the purchase price. So you're going to need to have about $132,000 in terms of a down payment saved up. And then your loan amount is going to be $528,000. So if you think back 2 years ago, this property would have cost you on a monthly basis about $2,500 because 2 years ago, the interest rate on a DSCR investment loan was 4%. But today it's closer to 8%. So it changes things about $1,300 or just over $1,300. It changes your monthly payment. So I wanted to just show you how that looks in terms of net cash flow, because again, looking at gross numbers, it feels intuitively like, oh, this is going to be a really good deal because the income's so high. But when you actually look at net numbers, it kind of tells a different story. So again, income is $7,000. Your mortgage now is $3,800. Cleaning fee estimate, taxes, and insurance. These are all estimates of what that type of property probably would cost. You're left with about $1,000 of net cash flow. So, it's not like I would not take $1,000 if someone was giving it to me, but you had to put down $132,000 to get there. So your cash on cash return is not the greatest, and it's on a $660,000 property. So you compare that type of property to this one, which again, most people wouldn't write home about. This is our most recent deal here that we bought just in January or February. Can't remember if we closed January or February, but just this year. So this one, we just went live with it in May. And you can look up the address. It's 1318 Oak Street in Michigan City. And it looks like a pretty crappy single family home, which is what it was. But then it had this ADU in the back, or carriage house, or casita, depending on what part of the country you live in. But it basically was an apartment in the back that was all gutted, but it had utilities run to it. It was an existing apartment. So you're getting two houses for the price of one, basically. And so we rehabbed this over the next couple months, and this is what it looks like now. So in May, we went live with it. And, we just painted the stucco on the outside. We put in some new windows. We rehabbed the inside of both properties. And we went live with two separate listings. And then we have a super listing where we list the house and the apartment in the back together. So larger groups can book as well. And so here, I just want to share with you what the numbers look like on this type of property. So the purchase price was about $95,000. We put $120,000 into it between the main house and the studio apartment in the back. And then we got it appraised in May for $347,000. So we created a bunch of equity through the rehab. I don't think it would have sold for $347,000. My estimate was like $280,000, $290,000, but typically, when it looks like this at the end, it's nicer than any property in the area, and we get a favorable appraisal. So that's what the appraisal came in at. But the average nightly rate on the main house is $195,000. Again, that's higher in the summer, lower in the winter, and the studio, it's $125,000. And we just estimated an average of 61% occupancy, and that's based on others that we have in the area. And it's a conservative estimate. We hit 70% pretty easily on most of ours. So if that's the case, again, now this one, we're making almost the exact same as that average Destin property on a monthly basis. We're making $7,000 gross. But when you look at the expense side of the equation, that's what changes everything. So our mortgage is $1,698 because, again, it's a very affordable property. The taxes are super affordable. The insurance is much lower. Cleaning is about the same. Utilities and Wi-Fi about the same. The rest of it, it's about the same. We don't have a pool or any extra amenities to take care of. So it costs us $4,284 on a monthly basis, but it leaves us with $2,844 of monthly net cash flow after all our expenses. So, and that's on almost no down payment. Really, after we refinanced it with Easy Street Capital. We just closed actually a couple weeks ago. And we ended up doing a 70% loan to value because it had such a high appraisal, and we could get all of our cash out with 70% loan to value. So we really had no cash into it, and we were able to get a 7.5% interest rate because it was a lower loan to value than if we had gone up to 75%, which is their typical refinance loan to value. So, so on a very small investment, and no cash out of pocket really, we're making $2,844 on a monthly basis. So that's the power of this type of property compared to the traditional single family short-term rental that you typically see in these higher end vacation areas. So, so I just want to mention, I personally work with people to help them find, buy, and set up their first high cash flowing short-term rental like this. I've worked with over 200 people now to do this over the last 3 years since I left my full-time job. And you can set up a call with me to talk through it. These are not like high pressure sales calls or anything. It's just, I want to know your goals and make sure there's alignment there if you're interested in working together. And I do a discount for Baselane customers. So we would definitely offer a discount for this community because I'm a huge supporter of Baselane, and a big believer in the platform that they've created. It's been really beneficial for me. So if you're interested in that, you can set up a call on my calendar. You just go to livingoffrentals.com/call. There's a short questionnaire there, and then you'll get access right to my calendar, and you can book a call with me, and we can talk through, your goals and see if it's a good fit. But, that being said, I'd love to answer any questions that might have come up.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kirby. And for anyone who's listening, we will send the recording and also a link to this after. So definitely watch out for that in your email inbox. If you have any questions, please just put them in the chat and we'll go from there. We have about 3 minutes left. So I'm going to ask this one question from Garrett. It's the first one there, but again, if you have any more, please drop them in. And I have a couple questions as well, because like I said, I'm very interested.
Good.
So the first question was about if you had used your VA loan at all to start and grow your business, but more generally, how do you typically do your financing for your STR purchases as well?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, so if you served in the military, the VA loan is an incredible asset that I didn't really even recognize in the beginning. So you can use it to buy up to a 4-unit property as long as you're going to live in one of the units, and it's 100% financing. So typically what you see at closing is that you get tax prorations back because you're paying taxes in arrears. So the seller is paying you a tax proration. So you get 100% financing, you get this tax proration, and you walk away with a house and a check in your hand. So it's like they pay you to buy a house. So and the rate's about the lowest that you can possibly get. So it's absolutely incredible. If you have that benefit, use it and buy a multi-unit property. Don't buy a single family with it, in my opinion. So I did use it on our first property that we bought in Northwest Indiana, where we finished that basement. And it was a huge help to me. I couldn't use it on the farm because we already own that property with the VA loan. So I had to use like a second home loan on the farm and put 10% down. But regardless, what I recommend to people is if you're working a W-2 job, use a conventional loan. You can get a primary loan for your primary residence, and you can house hack like we're doing on the farm. And it doesn't have to be like with roommates. It can be like, a separate barn, a separate structure, finished basement, but basically live for free. If you eliminate the highest line item in your budget for the rest of your life, people don't understand the power of that. It by far, in my opinion, the most impactful personal finance decision you can make. Because if people are paying $2,500 a month for housing, for rent or mortgage or whatever, and that's a pretty cheap one, think about eliminating that and living for free. And you can do it in a way that really doesn't impact your life at all. So right now we're traveling and our barn is rented out, and we're actually renting our main house too, which I didn't even talk about, but we do that as when we're out of town, and it offsets like so much cost. But so use a conventional loan for your primary, and then use a second home loan, which is another conventional loan. If you're working a W-2 job, you can qualify for this typically, which is only, I think it's 10% down. Yeah, it's a 90% loan to buy a secondary property. And then beyond that, typically you need to get into DSCR loans, and that's what we use on most of our investment properties. It's 20 to 25% down. And then the bank, as long as it cash flows, the bank covers the other 75 to 80% of the purchase price. And you can get pretty creative combining a DSCR loan with a private loan. We've done that on quite a few properties to where you really have no money out of pocket, or you can do the burst strategy. There's a lot of different ways to make it pretty interesting.
Amazing. Sorry, Kirby, do you have just a few more minutes? We have some good
Oh
questions.
yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic. So we'll go a little bit over today for those of you who are listening. So I think this is another good question, because I know from previous conversations, you actually sometimes need to use multiple platforms like Airbnb and Vrbo. So one question was, how much do you pay Airbnb? But in general, what is your cost just to be on those platforms? Like how much do they take versus how much you pay? How does that work?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'd say probably 70% of our bookings come from Airbnb, even though we're listed on Vrbo and we have a direct booking website. It's called Dune Dwellings. You can, directly book all of our properties there. But Airbnb has the vast majority of the market share. And the way they structure it is they charge the host 3%. So it's 3% fee out of our pocket on every booking. And then they charge the guest, it's somewhere between 14 and 17%. Once you calculate all their fees and taxes, sales tax and all that stuff. So it's pretty significant on the guest side, but on the host side, it's not. I mean, in my opinion, paying 3% to get consistent bookings is a pretty small marketing budget. If I had to go out and get consistent bookings on my own, I'd be paying a lot more than 3%. So I'm
Mhm.
pretty happy to pay it. And then there's also checks and balances built in with Airbnb. Like you can see guest previous positive reviews and screen guests that way. They have a host guarantee up to, I think it's $2 million, that if there's any damage, they'll cover it based on certain conditions. So, it's not like they just write you a check, but you have to, show how much it costs for the damages and that sort of thing. So there's some pretty good checks and balances built in.
Fantastic. I think that is good to know. I think people are always cautious about paying out to another platforms. That's good. This one is an interesting question, and I actually know someone here at Baselane who does this strategy. But what do you think about a short-term rental that you don't own but you rent? So you're renting from someone and then renting it as a short-term rental.
Yeah, so a lot of times people refer to this as arbitrage or co-hosting, or there's a lot of different ways you could structure it, but it can be a good strategy. It's I think less popular these days than it was when Airbnb first started to grow, because you could really arbitrage. Like there was a huge differential between long-term rent and short-term rent, and a lot of people just didn't know how to do short-term rentals themselves. So I think it was easier to do then, but it can still work really well. The thing is, you have to just be clear on what your goals are. And if you don't have any cash to work with, and your goal is just to create as much cash flow as quickly as possible, then maybe going out and finding properties that are ready to be rented is the way to go. The only income that you're making on those properties is that spread between the long-term rent and the short-term rent. But the landlord who's renting it to you, he's still making money. He's still making profit. He's not going to rent it to you at a loss. So if you think about it, if you own the property, then you'd be making what the landlord's making plus the spread that you would have made on renting it, plus tax benefits, plus appreciation, plus every time somebody rents, they're paying down your mortgage on a monthly basis. So you're just creating equity every single booking. So there's all of these additional benefits that come with owning the property. So I'm much more in the mindset of being an investor, long-term owner, building wealth over time, in addition to cash flow, which is really important. So I think there's a place for it, but I think if you can own the asset, I think you'll be much happier 10 years from now, because nobody can pull that rug out from under you. An owner could always say, I'm not continuing the lease next year. You furnish this property. It's great. It's got a history of bookings. I'm just going to do it myself now. So that's always the risk with arbitrage.
Okay, fantastic. And that's really good to know, actually. So we just, for time's sake, we'll do one more question, and thank you again, Kirby, for taking the extra time with us. Really appreciate it. But this one I think is very top of mind for anyone who's looking at STR. So the question is, how do you find cleaning people? But I'd like to know a little bit more about, what is your team for STR? I know cleaners are a big one, but there's also other maintenance. And how do you find them? How do you screen them? What's that process like?
Yeah, great question. So I am a huge proponent of, it's technically self-management, but it's almost like a hybrid structure. So if you hire a professional short-term rental manager, typically it's somewhere between 20 and 30% of your gross income that you got to pay them, which is a huge chunk, especially as you start to scale, that you're paying. And so I want to self-manage, but I also don't want to be on my phone 24/7. We have 24 different listings now. If I was just doing it all myself, I'd be a crazy person, and I wouldn't be on this this webinar right now. What I highly recommend is just putting a few key team members in place. And so if you're just starting with your first one, all you need is a really good handyman and a really good cleaner. As long as you have those two people, you can assign and define everything that could potentially come up, from regular cleanings to emergency situations. Like, somebody's assigned that role, boots on the ground, so you never have to be at that property if you don't want to be. We have properties I haven't visited in over a year because we have a great handyman and cleaner. Then you can do, with one property, it's very simple to do absolutely everything else from your phone on the Airbnb app. Airbnb has stolen all the technology of all the third-party apps out there that were popped up over the years, like automated messaging, automated pricing, all the stuff that you used to have to tack on. It's now integrated into the app. So with just the app from anywhere in the world, you can take your bookings, you can send check-in instructions, you can change your lock codes, you can answer questions. Like the guest doesn't know if you're right down the street or across the world. We have all of our properties are in Indiana, other than a few we're setting up here in Florida right now. And our business runs the exact same whether we're there or here. And so once we got to 4 or 5, that's when we brought on a guest relations VA. And because that was kind of the tipping point for us, when it was like, okay, now it's getting enough to be enough messaging. Like if you have one, it's maybe like a message or two a day. It's very manageable. But once we got to 4 or 5, it was enough to where we're like, okay, we have enough cash flow and economies of scale to where it makes sense to hire somebody who can be anywhere in the world again. And they can take all the bookings, they can line up the cleaners, they can answer all the guest questions. They can do everything that we were doing remotely. So now we have our boots on the ground team and our remote team that do all the day to day. And then we're still involved. Like, I never want to portray this as like mailbox money where you're just sitting back on a beach and doing nothing. Like, we still manage the team members, and do things, from a strategic level. We're making decisions, and if there's a big issue that pops up, we'll get involved. But our team now has been so well trained and practiced that they can answer almost any question that pops up. They take the bookings, they decide, they screen the guests, they make decisions on our behalf, and it's much less expensive than paying 25% of our gross income on a monthly basis.
That's fantastic. Like, really, like, I think that's a good thing for people who are interested in investment in general. Is you set up your team. It's going to take time at the beginning to get them trained, to get them onboarded, but it is worth it in the end. Thank you so much, Kirby. I realize we went over time here, but I do appreciate it. For anyone who has other questions in the chat, I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions, but you do have the link to Kirby's livingoffrentals.com/call link. So definitely check that out and take a look. And the Living Off Rentals podcast is definitely a must listen for anyone who's interested in growing and investing. Kirby, thank you again so much for being with us today. I appreciate it and really appreciate your expertise. I myself was one of those people who was thinking about investing in a beachfront STR and definitely reconsidering that after this call. So thank you so much.
No problem. It's great to be here. Thanks a lot for having me, Nate.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. And thank you for joining, and keep a lookout in your inbox for the recording of the presentation as well. And again, please head over to livingoffrentals.com and check it out. And please feel free to check out Baselane if you want to invest in STR and you want to get your banking in order as well.